September 1st, 1943. The air above Rabaul airfield hung heavy, thick with heat, volcanic dust and the faint sweetness of aviation fuel. Inside a canvas command tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburō Sakai, a legend of the imperial skies, a warrior carved from air and steel, studied a single sheet of paper. One eye was a clouded pearl, the gift of a dauntless tail gunner's bullet. The other, sharp and alive, had guided him through more than 60 victories. He read the intelligence report once, then again. A sound broke the stagnant heat. Not an engine, not a shout, a laugh. It started small, then rolled into a deep, confident roar. Sakai read aloud, voice edged with amusement. The Americans have built a new fighter. They call it the Hellcat. The name alone drew grins, brash, crude, unmistakably American. But it was the specifications that set the tent alive with laughter. Nearly 6 tons, twice the weight of their beloved Zero. It sounded impossible, ridiculous. To men who flew machines so light they felt like living things, the idea of a 6-ton fighter was insanity. Their aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, was poetry in motion, feather light, razor sharp, a whisper that killed. For 2 years it had ruled the Pacific sky unchallenged, a ghost that outturned, outclimbed and outdanced everything the Allies dared to send. Through the open flap, Sakai looked at them, rows of sleek silver Zeros lined along the runway. Gleaming like blades waiting for dawn, they had humbled British Hurricanes, shredded American P-40s and toyed with Dutch Brewsters. To the Japanese aviators, these planes were not machines. They were extensions of the soul guided by discipline and spirit, the embodiment of the samurai ideal. The new American fighter, heavy and graceless, was an insult, a flying truck wearing a soldier's uniform. The consensus rippled through the tent like wind through paper walls. It'll be another easy kill. None of them could have known that the laughter echoing across that humid morning was history's last calm breath before the storm. Because that fat, ugly American plane wasn't a mistake. It was a message, a steel prophecy of a new kind of war. Within 2 years, it would erase the legend of the Zero, burn 5,000 of them from the sky, and turn mastery into extinction. The era of the Zero was closing. The age of the Hellcat was about to begin. To grasp the shock that the Hellcat unleashed, you first have to know the myth it was built to kill, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. In late 1941 and early 1942, the Zero wasn't an airplane. It was a phenomenon. It appeared above Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Singapore like a silver apparition, fast, fluid, almost supernatural. Allied pilots who lived to tell of it spoke with disbelief, whispering as if recounting ghost stories. They described a fighter that could climb like a rocket, turn as if weightless, and dance around anything that tried to catch it. The numbers bordered on myth. At Pearl Harbor, Japan lost just 29 planes while wrecking or crippling over 300. In the skies of the Philippines, 7 losses for 100-plus victories. Everywhere the same story, the Zero was untouchable. When American engineers finally examined a captured specimen in 1942, the famed Akutan Zero, they thought the data had to be wrong. A fighter with the reach of a bomber, the agility of a biplane and the bite of a predator? Impossible. But the truth was far stranger and darker. The Zero was the product of a beautiful cruelty. Its creator, Jiro Horikoshi, had been given an impossible order: build a carrier-based fighter faster, lighter and longer ranged than anything on land. To do it, he made a Faustian bargain. Every ounce of safety was sacrificed for performance. The frame was forged from a top-secret aluminum alloy, extra super duralumin, giving it miraculous strength at half the weight. But there was no armor behind the pilot's seat. A single tracer in the wrong place meant death. Fuel tanks didn't seal. Radios were often stripped to save a handful of pounds. Every nut, every bolt was questioned. If it didn't make the plane faster, it didn't survive the blueprint. The result was art and suicide. Its wing loading only 22 pounds per square foot. granted it a turn radius of barely 600 feet. It could literally carve circles around its enemies. Ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa wrote, "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The plane answers thought, not control." To him, American aircraft were trucks, heavy, loud, wasteful. Japan's Navy Air Service believed that skill and spirit conquered all, that a true pilot needed only mastery, not metal. In their hands, the Zero was not a machine but a brush, and combat was the canvas. So when the first intelligence brief on the new Grumman F6F Hellcat reached their desks in early 1943, it was met with open scorn. The stats read like satire. Loaded weight, 12,000 pounds. The Zero was barely half that. Wing loading, 36.5 pounds per square foot. A turning circle nearly 1,000 feet wide. It carried 212 pounds of armor, bulletproof glass, self-sealing tanks, and 2,400 rounds for 6 heavy guns. To the samurai in flight suits, it was absurd. They saw a clumsy hulk built to survive, not to soar. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactician behind Pearl Harbor, reviewed the specs and laughed in print. The Americans have learned nothing. They think machinery can replace the man. By the mathematics they trusted, he was right. In a turning duel, the sacred dance of air combat, the Hellcat would die every time. And so they laughed again, convinced the numbers guaranteed victory. They mistook arrogance for certainty. What they couldn't see was that the Americans weren't coming to duel at all. They were coming to end the duel. The first warning would arrive 3 weeks later, in the pale skies over Marcus Island. The illusion began to crack on September 30th, 1943. Near Marcus Island, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui, a seasoned Zero pilot, flew escort for a reconnaissance craft through calm blue air he thought he understood. He knew the Pacific's moods, its crosswinds, its hidden thermals, the faint shimmer that always warned of danger. Then 6 dark shapes rose from the southeast. Too broad, too bulky for fighters, he thought. Perhaps B-25 bombers off course. Only when the light caught their wings did realization strike. One huge radial engine. A thick barrel chest, stubby wings, he wrote later. First contact with F6F type fighter. My first thought. Americans have mounted guns on a torpedo plane. It was ugly. Brutish, ungraceful. Fukui felt no fear, only curiosity. He and his wingman prepared the standard ritual. Roll into a diving turn, slice inside the enemy's arc, lock on from the tail, and burn him down. The maneuver had never failed them. He expected the heavy American craft to flounder, to plow forward while the Zeros looped behind like dancers with blades. But the impossible happened. The Hellcat didn't turn. It didn't flee. It went vertical. Fukui stared, stunned. The blue shape pitched nose up and climbed, not sluggishly, but with raw, violent power that defied every equation he knew. The source was a monster engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder furnace throwing out 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero's own. The 6-ton fighter was now soaring upward at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow. His lighter Zero shuddered. Its speed drained away as gravity claimed it. In seconds, the hunter became the prey. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a maneuver no heavy aircraft should ever manage. A perfect hammerhead stall turn, pirouetting through the sky and dropping neatly onto Fukui's tail. The American opened fire. 6 machine guns, not 4, unleashed a torrent of 50 caliber fury. In 3 heartbeats, 1,700 rounds ripped through the Zero's unarmored shell. The cockpit thundered, metal shrieked, glass shattered. By instinct alone, Fukui threw his fighter into a wild spin, limping back to Marcus Island with smoke trailing from its wings. His wingman vanished into the sea. So did the reconnaissance plane they were guarding. The first kill belonged to the Hellcat. Confusion spread through command. The overweight American brute wasn't supposed to climb, wasn't supposed to fight like that. The rules were changing, and 1 week later, those new rules would be written in fire over Wake Island. A week later, The new reality struck with brutal clarity above Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros to intercept what looked like another minor carrier raid. They climbed through thin cloud to 20,000 feet, waiting to pounce. Below, a dozen dark blue fighters drifted in loose formation. 12 F6Fs, Shiga noted in his diary. We held every advantage, height, position, surprise. Victory certain. They dove. It should have been a slaughter. But the Americans didn't panic. They didn't scatter or twist to meet the threat. They simply tipped their noses forward and accelerated. These lighter Zeros struggled to follow. Designed for turn, not dive, they fell behind, their bullets sparking harmlessly against metal hides that refused to burn. Those 200 pounds of armor wrapped around each Hellcat pilot like an iron womb. The self-sealing tanks soaked up holes that would have doomed any Zero. What the samurai flyers saw below them were not planes. They were armored beasts. When the Japanese pulled out of their dives, short of airspeed and ammunition, the counterattack came. But it wasn't a duel. It was a physics lesson. The Hellcats didn't wheel around to fight. They climbed, using weight as weapon, horsepower as blade. At altitude, the Zero's unsupercharged engine gasped for air. Performance collapsed. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat was still roaring. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote. Their mass gave them speed we could not match. They dove, fired, and vanished upward again. It was a slaughter. 8 Zeros fell in minutes, not a single Hellcat was lost. The sacred dance of the turning fight had been erased. The truth crashed in like gunfire. The Americans hadn't built a plane to outturn the Zero. They had built one that made turning irrelevant. They studied every strength of their enemy and engineered a weapon to cancel it. This was energy fighting, a doctrine that treated air combat as mathematics. Speed was energy. Altitude was energy. The higher, faster pilot controlled the battle's gravity. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch had already invented a pattern that embodied this new logic, the Thatch weave. 2 fighters moving in interlocking loops, each guarding the other's tail, drawing attackers into the crossfire of a partner unseen. Combined with the Hellcat's power, it turned combat from art to algorithm. Japanese pilots, trained as solitary swordsmen, now faced a coordinated machine. In November 1943, veteran ace Tatsuo Tanemizu tried to explain to his men at Rabaul, "Forget what you know. The Americans no longer fight as warriors. They fight as executioners." He described how the enemy flew in pairs, one high, one low, weaving, talking, hunting as one body. Those heavy radios they had mocked now became the Americans' unseen weapon. "We fly as individual samurai," he warned. "They fight as a single system." And that system reached far beyond the cockpit. On their carriers, controllers stared into glowing radar scopes that could see 50, 70, 100 miles through cloud and darkness. They guided their Hellcats like chess pieces, plotting each intercept before the Japanese even knew they'd been found. Lieutenant Sadama Kamachi remembered it with horror. "We were climbing through clouds when they struck. No warning, no sighting. They knew our heading, our height, our speed. We were blind men attacked by those who could see in the dark." The gap was no longer tactical. It was civilizational. The gulf between the two nations widened until it was no longer a contest of pilots, but of worlds. Japan had entered the war with an elite brotherhood, small, brilliant, irreplaceable. Their training demanded 3 years and more than 700 flight hours before a cadet touched combat. They were the best men ever to fly cloth and metal, but the Hellcat was killing them faster than Japan could create replacements. By early 1944, the system had collapsed. Fuel shortages forced cadets to practice in gliders. Ammunition was rationed to a few rounds per session. New pilots reached the front with barely 200 hours in the air. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a weary instructor, wrote in despair, "We send children to fight professionals. One boy arrived yesterday. He had never fired his guns in flight. He died 7 minutes later. The samurai were gone. What remained were farmers with swords, thrown into a mechanized storm." Across the ocean, the American war engine ran with terrifying precision. Training fields in Texas and Florida churned out pilots who had already logged 300 hours, 50 of them inside a Hellcat. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, landed on carriers until the motions became instinct. They entered battle as products of a factory that built skill the way it built steel. All the elements, aircraft, tactics, radar, discipline, merged into inevitability. It culminated in one day of annihilation. June 1944, the Philippine Sea. Japan gathered 9 carriers and 450 planes for Operation A-Go, a desperate strike meant to erase the American fleet. Facing them, 15 U.S. carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, half of them Hellcats. Admiral Ozawa launched his first wave of 69 planes. American radar saw them, 150 miles out. Controllers vectored dozens of Hellcats to meet them in perfect geometry, sun at their backs, altitude supreme. Lieutenant Zenji Abe looked up and froze. A wall of dark blue fighters, stacked in layers from 20 to 30,000 feet. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese planes, 42 burned before they could fire a second burst. The rest scattered into the sea. Commander David McCampbell recalled, "We'd dive from above, shoot one down, zoom back to altitude. They'd try to follow, stall, and another Hellcat would finish the job." By nightfall, Japan had lost 346 carrier planes and dozens more from land. America lost 30. In the ready rooms, pilots laughed in disbelief. "Why, hell," one joked. "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had ended Japan's carrier air arm in a single afternoon. For the survivors, the psychological wound was total. They no longer saw opponents in the sky, only an invisible, all-seeing mechanism. Psychologists would later call it Hellcat syndrome, the dread of fighting a system rather than a man. Admiral Ozawa's own report captured the horror. The enemy's radar-guided fighters achieved what we thought impossible, the industrialization of air combat. The laughter that once echoed through the tents of Rabaul had turned to silence. And in that silence, Japan conceived its final weapon, the kamikaze. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the Suicide Corps, gave the logic coldly. If a Zero attacks normally, it dies for nothing. If it becomes the bomb, the chance of success is 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least this way, his death has meaning. It was the last confession of defeat, the acknowledgement that no tactic, no spirit could pierce the Hellcat's steel curtain. And yet even in this grim new war, the Hellcat would find a final role, not as predator but as protector. When the fighting finally ended, the scale of America's power stood exposed in metal and numbers. At Bethpage, New York, the Grumman plant had run day and night, no pauses, no silence. At its height, a new F6F Hellcat rolled off the line every single hour. In just 30 months, more than 12,000 were built. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 35,000 fighters of all types. Japan managed barely 5,000. When designer Jiro Horikoshi, father of the Zero, examined a captured Hellcat after the war, his verdict was brutally simple. "We built for 1941, they built for 1945. While we perfected the sword, they forged the factory." Decades later, the old ace Saburō Sakai, the man who once laughed at that first report, was asked what he thought of the Hellcat. His answer carried no bitterness, only truth. "The Zero made Japan believe it was mighty," he said. "The Hellcat made us realize we were not. We thought ourselves samurai. The Hellcat showed we were merely men with old weapons facing the future." He paused, then added, "Every Japanese pilot who lived did so because a Hellcat pilot allowed it. That is defeat in its purest form, existence granted by your enemy's mercy." The men who had mocked the Hellcat's weight, its bulk, its ugliness, never grasped what that weight meant. It meant a larger engine they could not craft, armor plate for pilots they could not replace, fuel tanks that refused to burn. It meant radios linking squadrons into a single mind and steel thick enough to trade metal for lives. The extra weight was the weight of a philosophy, one that valued systems over heroes, production over passion. A nation that built not only a better fighter, but a better method of war. By the time the laughter stopped, Japan's proud Air Force had vanished into the clouds it once ruled. Its pilots, once artists of the sky, had become kamikaze shadows. And through the smoke and silence, one truth remained. The Hellcat always had the last laugh.